All right, we're on. Hey guys, I'm back. I'm sure you all missed me so much last week. Hopefully everyone had a good time and had a good session. Biddle, how's it going? Good morning.
Yeah, I forgot to let the audience know that you were on a 1 week well-deserved PTO last week. You were in
Mhm.
Scotland, right? Is that right?
Yeah, very damp on the first day. Didn't anticipate it being as cold as I thought it was going to be, which I've been informed by everyone I know. I am an idiot for not thinking it was going to be cold, but it was nice to get away. And luckily, I have two amazing co-hosts that can host this show without me, so I don't need to be here all the time. How are you doing, John? Back on the show. Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me back. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Okay, let's kick off. So, welcome everyone to the Keys to AWS Optimization, the show where we share stories, concepts, and solutions to help you unlock your cost optimization at AWS. My name is Stephanie Gooch. I am a commercial architect at AWS. Been here for over a year now, getting back into the swing of things. I tell you, Monday was pretty hard after being on holiday. But yeah, loving it and dealing with these guys with all financial operations stuff.
Awesome. And hey, everyone, Michael Biddle here. I've been at AWS for a little over one dog year, eight and a half years. Commercial architect supporting our global and strategic accounts with cost optimization. And John, we've met you here before, but for our folks who didn't get the chance to watch you last episode, why don't you kind of just introduce yourself?
Yeah, so also on the optics team here, supporting our strategic accounts. Spent about 15 years kind of in industry, and looking forward to talking about CloudWatch today because kind of a big part of that part of work I did prior to AWS was focused on building systems and observabilities. Kind of a big part of that. So looking forward to kind of sharing some of the details on CloudWatch.
Nice. So we've got a real range of experience with the three of us working with CloudWatch in different areas. It's going to be interesting. But as always, we want to hear from you guys. So if you're watching, please feel free to comment and talk to us about how you use CloudWatch, if you've made any savings with it, or if you've identified any savings with it, or any kind of cost optimization questions you have for us. Just drop them in the chat. Or if you would like to get in contact outside of this show, feel free to tweet me or email us. And you can also find everything we put on these channels on our YouTube channel. So classic, feel free to subscribe there and check out John's last episode on EBS to learn a bit more about him and some cool ways in which you can save money on EBS. So let's dive into CloudWatch, which is something that I'm going to say at the top where whenever I have conversations with customers, they don't necessarily bring up CloudWatch when they're talking about planning for moving to the cloud or as a big area that can save money, because it's not normally one of those kind of top tier services that will come up on your cost explorer. So this is quite a nice chat because it's normally maybe just underneath those five as sometimes being quite a high spender, and it's an unexpected spend. So John, do you want to give everyone like a level 100 description of what CloudWatch is?
Sure. Yeah, and I think just like you said, I think what happens a lot of times is, CloudWatch is doing its thing kind of behind the scenes. And it's helping us kind of understand what's going on in the environment. That old adage of, what gets measured gets managed. CloudWatch is an observability and monitoring service that you can use within AWS or within services that you have running on premises. And the cool part about this is that it's going to pull together, application data and infrastructure data kind of all together in one place. And it's pervasive across the AWS services that you're using today. And a lot of times that data, that the telemetry information that CloudWatch is grabbing is being fed into a number of different services. Some of these are internal tools that can make recommendations on cost savings, or we can use this just to gain more insight into the applications that we're running. So if you're one of those folks who's seen cost and usage report, you've seen the billing console, you're kind of wondering what's going on under the hood as far as actual utilization is, you're going to want to pay attention just to see how CloudWatch can help you understand a little bit more about what's happening with those workloads.
Brilliant. And I think one thing to note is like, especially the developers out there, I know I use CloudWatch all the time. When I was developing kind of Lambda functions, the amount of time I'm going in there to seeing what the hell's going on. And before I started working in cost, I was never really aware of how much that would cost me, because it's just kind of the resource that you're like, oh, I'll always have CloudWatch on and I'll always have my retention policy forever, just in case. And you'll have as many metrics as you think is needing, spitting out as much data. But while we're talking about that, maybe we should mention the pricing. So Brittle, do you want to cover some of the like top pricing elements for Cost Explorer? And I'm also good at CloudWatch and Cost Explorer. And I'll share the link for pricing. So we don't have to go into too much detail, but just so people can have
some
idea.
Key takeaways is it's a free service to use out the box to get you at least 5-minute interval monitoring on all your metrics, things such as CPU utilization, your network throughput, If you want to get metrics such as memory, there's a CloudWatch agent in addition to what comes out the box that you need to install into your server. And if you look at our pricing page, you can see that does carry a little bit of a price along with those memory metrics. But outside of that, everything's fairly turnkey, and we give you up to 15 months, of metric storage on those CloudWatch metrics. So it's a good first spot to go to before you start maybe seeing what the gaps are where you have to customize things in your environment. So if you haven't checked it out, check it out.
Yeah, have a brief look. I think it is good to know that these things do kind of come with a little cost. And it's one of those things that maybe every month you're spending a little bit, and over time, that kind of compound amount of spend can accumulate. So recommend, if anything, just going and reading the pricing page today would be great. But before we get into like savings of CloudWatch, let's talk about ways in which you can actually use CloudWatch to find savings, because that's also very relevant. So John, do you have any great examples of where you've been able to use CloudWatch to help customers find savings?
Yeah, and so I think 2 weeks ago when I was on the show last time, we were talking about a couple of the internal tools, stuff that we use like Trusted Advisor, Compute Optimizer. These are great ways to kind of take the metrics that we're getting from CloudWatch and kind of reduce this back down to like targeted areas where I could find those low utilization resources. Compute Optimizer and the Cost Explorer recommendations are both great ways to do this. I can pull out a big list of, take, for example, my EC2 instances, look for the ones that are low utilization that we're working with and kind of target those. We were actually just working with a customer recently where it turned out within their environment kind of had a large subset of EC2 instances that were part of a deprecated workload. They went through and were able to kind of pull those out and use the CloudWatch data that had been reduced down in that Cost Explorer recommendation to kind of target that workload, find out exactly what that is, and then just go through and kind of clean that up and terminate it.
Nice. What about you, Bill?
Yeah, well, I got a pretty good story with one of our gaming development customers. Long story short, we run mobile gaming, online, chat communities when you're playing, different various games, sporting content, things of that nature. You want to trash talk your friend, right? A lot of that's backed up on RDS storage for this particular customer. And so we did a deep dive into CloudWatch and found that there was about 14 databases that were hosting old chat rooms from customers who hadn't been active in over 2 years.
Oh, wow.
And so we went ahead and we looked at what do those have to be stored for compliance, right? Which of those can be deleted and which of those we can back up. And effectively, we cleaned those up and we saved about 30% on their daily costs for RDS for Aurora. Just kind of diving into CloudWatch and looking at resources that are idle. And then once we found that they're idle, it's like, how long have these been idle for? Let's look at different logs and kind of backtrack and root cause for this. So that's kind of a really higher level story. There's another one here we'll put in the chat in just a few moments with Washington Post. Shout out to Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post, right? He's got his team looking at CloudWatch metrics, and they used it to go over and look at their concurrency utilization for Lambda functions. And so they're able to streamline their concurrency for Lambda and save about 25% on those Lambda charges just by streamlining concurrency, looking at which opportunities there are, and simply in the out-of-the-box CloudWatch solution. So we'll put that in the chat here.
Nice. Those are great examples. And I think just going back to basics, maybe, we're not going to do a demo today of CloudWatch, but we might do another session on that because we wanted to get through quite a lot of high level elements of it today. But when you guys are working with customers looking at, let's take EC2, because I think that's a classic. I'm throwing these guys a curveball, by the way. We haven't prepped this. When we talk about things like EC2 and we're looking at the CloudWatch metrics, what are some things that you both look out for to kind of identify savings? If you're no Compute Optimizer, if you're just going in yourselves, where would you start, John?
I mean, I think the utilization metrics for CPU and memory, like Biddle was talking about, those are really, really good starting points. The CPU utilization alone, if we're just kind of targeting workloads that appear to be, really idle, that's a great way to get started. I think it's worth maybe talking a little bit about that memory metric and the memory utilization, because some of these metrics are ones that we have to enable to export from within that guest. But I want to maybe make a caveat there too, because what we find with a lot of customers is they don't need to go through and kind of apply that like condition of sending and exporting that metric across all the instances they have in the environment, or kind of do that correctively across every resource out there. We see some customers do instead is say, hey, for new workloads that I'm deploying, I want to enable that flag. Maybe I'm running a lot of like memory optimized instances, and the memory utilization is really important to me. So I can do that for like new workloads going forward, or I can just pick a subset of them. Like I've got a really big environment, I'm going to pick a small subset of those workloads and use that to gain some more insight into the environment, and do that without having to go through and kind of implement like a large scale change. Just use like a subset of this as an indication.
Nice. What about you, Biddle? Is there anything else that you look out for specifically?
Yeah, well, just on the point about CPU utilization, we're well aware there's more metrics than just CPU to kind of figure out what's a good resource-enabled workload. But what I recommend, if you're kind of at the part where you're like, we're early in this process, we're just getting more mature with our cloud financial management, I'd like all these metrics, but I got to work with what I have today. What are your suggestions? I would look at your C instances, like C5, C6Gs, even M's to start, anything that's really like compute optimized, and see what those CPU metrics are. Because, believe it or not, what we found is a lot of our customers that are using just the C instances, for example, even though they might not have the memory agent installed, they're really not using C machines to get memory optimization performance as it is. So it's kind of one of those where you can start there with some of the low hanging fruit. And as you start to kind of say, what's left after that low hanging fruit, what we'd look for is some of your network throughput performance, really. I mean, that's a good indication, like especially on databases, all right? If you have a volume with very little IO and out activity that you can see from CloudWatch metrics, that's an indication that maybe that's an opportunity to move that database to a serverless option, potentially, like RDS serverless. For example, if you see your IO has very intermittent activity, it's high reads at little clustered times of the day, and then it's silent for a few more days until it gets a lot of activity that corresponds with like business intelligence teams or something. You can source that from CloudWatch metrics, and that would be a great example of something that you could use to move to serverless.
Yeah, I'm just thinking now we should do a kind of hands-on thing that once when I first started, Bill spent a nice chunk of time with me going through loads of RDS detailed CloudWatch metrics and kind of looking through and looking for the trends and seeing what things are high, what are low, where you should look for utilization. So that might be a really good episode to do in the future. So season 3, we'll start looking out things to do on that. Just to throw it to an audience question, and thanks. And for those of you who are maybe just joining us kind of now as we're going, we're talking all about CloudWatch. So first of all, we're covering how you can utilize CloudWatch to save money. And then we're also going to cover in a little bit where you can save money with CloudWatch as well. But we have a question here that I'll read out. So some services or applications are quite greedy. Is there a way to set a profile threshold so that the utilizations alerts are not alarmed for this kind of development? So I'm guessing that if there's too much going on and it's costing too much money and sending too many triggers. Any ideas on that?
I think so. Yeah, sorry if we misunderstood the question, please correct us in the chat. But kind of how I read this was maybe you have an application where you expect to have high utilization, and if you were to set an alarm where you had it at utilizing over 80%, create an alarm trigger, it might create a lot of false flags or kind of extra workflows you don't need to go through. I don't necessarily have a one size fits all answer for that. I mean, if your workload is peaking a lot, you can definitely set the parameters of different periods of the time cycle, like over a 2-week period. If it hits like a 95th percentile max of whatever X metric is, alarm you. I think that my short answer would be there's nuance when you go into the metrics between average, the low point, the high point, the 95th percentile, the mean of the averages. So maybe it's an analytics solution that we work backwards from to see what's the right trigger point for you.
Yeah, and maybe one other piece there too is just that you have the ability to do custom metrics based on application performance too. So if there's like an application constraint like a queue depth, or there's some other performance characteristic for the app itself, you can always set that as kind of a priority trigger where we're going to get notifications as soon as the application gets bottlenecked, even if we're going to have underlying infrastructure that's by design going to max out a specific set of resources.
Awesome, thanks guys. So I wanted to jump back to something you both mentioned, which is the memory metric. And I don't think we've actually covered what that is. So do either one of you want to take that and just explain in detail, not in detail, just kind of what we're talking about there? John, do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah. So some of the metrics that we collect with CloudWatch are just kind of out of the box, right? We deploy an EC2 instance, and we're going to immediately have those metrics exported back out to CloudWatch. So CPU utilization, network performance, those are good examples of that. Other things like, the amount of capacity that we're utilizing actually on the disk itself. So how many gigabytes am I consuming on the disk? How much memory am I utilizing within the instance itself? Those are additional metrics that we can export easily with the CloudWatch agent on top of that guest EC2 instance. But in order to get that visibility, we want to go through and follow the steps to set up and configure that. So those are just I think two metrics to maybe be mindful of that we hear from customers like, hey, interested in getting this, and it's something that we can enable as an add-on.
Yeah, and I've just shared the link for that. And also I will do another one, which is another well-architected lab that shows you a bit how to go through these and how it connects to Compute Optimizer. So I recommend checking those two out. So I'm mindful of time. So before we move on to how we can save money with CloudWatch, was there anything else that you guys wanted to cover on utilizing CloudWatch?
No, I think just it goes back under the question we had earlier about alarms too. Like I look at alarms as, kind of like letting opportunities find you, right? Making money while you sleep. It's that same kind of idea, right? Set up mechanisms that set you for success. And so one of my larger customers that's in hardware manufacturing, what we looked at was, okay, we know from working with your Cloud Center of Excellence team and your lead engineers, you guys have defined that you think this application should, based on different peaks of the day, be between 50% CPU, 50% memory, right? Like whatever the metric is, what it is, define it. Now let's go put into the alarms and set off a threshold where if over a 2-week period, for example, that those resources that are creating that workload, if they fall out of what you've defined as that kind of expected level of utilization. So let's say you find in the 2-week alarm, it's now hovering at 20% CPU max. That's when we should look at leveraging things like AWS step functions or automated actions that are available out of the box in CloudWatch to either do something like potentially terminate the instance if it's something that you feel that strongly about. You can pause the instance, or you can kick off an SNS notification to whoever owns the resource, whoever the IAM resource owner is, and let them know that it's out of the boundaries that you've predetermined. You could even link that to Slack, create an alert, or have that create a Jira ticket afterwards. The point is we want to help you use CloudWatch to really start those workflows so that you can focus on the strategy after the fact to then remediate that solution. So that's my call to action on alarms, specifically CloudWatch alarms, and how you can use those to find opportunities for you.
Awesome. And I think just to, there's also a link just from talking about the memory section we were just talking about, posted from GitHub. But to follow up from what Biddle was just saying, this conversation is very similar to the one we had about budgets. So it's the same concept. So set alarms around information that you have, but then make sure you continuously check it. So set a threshold that you think is correct, and then go back and review it. Don't assume that because you set a budget, it's going to catch your overspend, or don't assume that you set an alert on your usage. So these things are very similar. And feel free to go and check out our budgets episode that's on our YouTube channel, Keys to AWS Optimization. We have 2 questions, one from Alex. So I think we kind of touched on this, but would you suggest adding memory to all of your EC2 instances in your environment?
Yeah, I think it may be a little bit of a workload by workload thing, and maybe what some of the considerations are for adding, the CloudWatch agent on top of those guests. For some organizations, it's easy to do that, and I think if it's easy to enable that extra level of visibility, it's fantastic. Great to have that extra dimension, because it's going to help a lot with understanding the right size for your instances, what the actual utilization is. If that's not an option, or if it's something that's difficult to implement, a lot of times, there are different considerations for doing that. The strategy I like that I mentioned earlier is just kind of picking that subset, or for new workloads, going ahead and enabling that sometimes that corrective step of going back and kind of retroactively applying that across instances could be a challenge for some. So not necessarily a requirement, to get that.
Yeah, nice. I would agree.
Awesome. And then one more quick from Rob. I think we covered this as well. Are tools or maybe we didn't actually. Our tools like Compute Optimizer using the CloudWatch data as their source. I believe that's correct, that it is all based on CloudWatch data, right?
Yeah, it's
It
a
is,
primary
yeah,
source.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. All right. Thanks as always for questions. Feel free to keep dropping them in our next bit as we move to a topic that I'm really interested in, which is saving money with CloudWatch. So like I said at the start, customers we've seen don't always consider CloudWatch costs. I know that when I remember back in the day, engineering and building our infrastructure, we never really thought about CloudWatch being a cost. And then more and more we're seeing it kind of, they are maybe putting on that data metric on all of their EC2 instances and are expecting as much cost. Or they might have a third-party app that's kind of utilizing and exporting lots of metrics all the time and increasing their costs. So let's dive into how, if you do see that CloudWatch cost rising and you start to see it as one of your top 5 on your cost explorer, where we should start. So I'm just going to keep talking for a second and I'll let these guys join in a sec. So first of all, I really want to shout out again this query in the Well Architected Labs, which is my go-to query now. Anytime I get a customer that wants to talk about cost, I nearly always run this query just to see what their CloudWatch spend is doing and what their CloudWatch specifically is being costed by. So is it the dashboards? Is it the metrics? I want to see what's costing it. And then cheekily as well, I have this blog. I didn't write this one, but it's a great blog which will show you based on that query what you could quickly do to look at your costs. So if you're looking for some resources from today and see that your CloudWatch cost is going high, check out those two. But I'll stop talking now. So Biddle, what would you do first of all whenever you start to see CloudWatch costs are high? What do you look for?
Yeah, one of the first things I look at, and actually we saw this with Vanguard, they spoke about it at reInvent like 2-3 years ago. There were some folks that had turned on per minute monitoring on the applications. So, you know, like you said earlier, CloudWatch comes out the box for free with 5-minute intervals of monitoring. So, you know, people doing all intents, you know, best purposes type of activity, wanted to get more insight to the application, turned on 1-minute intervals. They weren't really necessary, and it caused the cost of CloudWatch to spike quite a bit, like thousands more than they were anticipating. And so it was simply a matter of just moving back to the 5-minute interval for those applications that weren't as time sensitive to those types of time periods. So that would be my first thing. If you see costs go up, like look back. Things that you can do to look back is like if you go into Cost Explorer, you can see like by usage type. If you put your service as CloudWatch, what are the usage types that are contributing to the cost? Find the anti-pattern. That's step 1. And then step 2 would be, you know, you can look at CloudTrail, for example, and you can go into, so under event names, like within CloudTrail, you can type in CloudWatch, and you can see what type of IAM profile or user or activity is initiating this type of increase of CloudWatch usage and activity, and you can root cause and work backwards off of that. So that's really where I start primarily.
That CloudTrail call out is a great one, especially if and I don't mean to be, I'm not being rude about third-party apps, but usually when we have third-party apps, I feel like there can sometimes be a role dedicated to them. I think I've seen, and so if you can see if there's a third-party name in there, you can go and see what's going on. Not that they're the blame of the cost. We love our partners, just to state that fact. John, what would you do? What is your kind of key things to look out for?
Yeah. So that the query that you mentioned is a great starting point. I think what happens sometimes is we've got to figure out like where is the spend coming from. CloudWatch allows us to capture log data as well as metric data, and I have the option to kind of set my log retention, and that could be as long as I want. I keep those logs indefinitely. So it's important to first start by understanding, hey, the CloudWatch data, are we looking at a cost increase based on logs or based on the metrics? And then, kind of the next step we could take from there, say it's on the metrics side of things, is looking at, kind of what those driving factors are. The call that you guys just mentioned, that one around like third-party apps, get metric data API request. That's kind of one that I think it gets commonly seen. So we'll have folks that will integrate in, like a third-party tool that's using the CloudWatch metrics, and they'll be pulling that very, very frequently. And if you're pulling that data really frequently, you increase the amount of requests, and that can have a cost component that will drive up as a result. So one option there is to kind of either reduce the frequency, or if you're using that get metric data API request, you can actually grab more metrics per request than you might be doing already. So you can actually grab the 500 metrics and 100,000 data points per pull with that. So there may be an option to reduce the amount of requests while still pulling the same amount of data back out.
Awesome. And one other one that I found recently was having detailed monitoring on, which is not something I'm super familiar with, but I'm going to share this link. I was talking to somebody who was working with a customer, and they realized that they had detailed monitoring on for everything. And it turns out that none of their developers were ever using it because the basic versions were absolutely fine, but they were paying for it because there's no charge on the normal basic monitoring. And so by turning off detailed monitoring, they save 50% of their cloud trail costs, which, as we've seen, sometimes that kind of can ramp up a bit.
Yeah, one other call out really here when you're kind of looking at different use cases that increase the cost for CloudWatch. Unofficially, I've kind of seen when I start to look at CloudWatch costs, I'll also look at costs for Glue. They typically have a bit of a correlation with each other. And if you see that pattern where Glue and CloudWatch look like a very similar growth chart on your graph, someone somewhere is probably ingesting those metrics using Glue and doing some sort of insight on it, which is the right thing to do analysis on it. But I would just then go back root cause and look backwards at like, what tags are associated with those Glue jobs. You might find it's for something like fraud prevention, risk detection, right? And it's like, cool, go work with that team and see what you guys doing in Glue, because it's creating a one-to-one correlation with our CloudWatch costs.
Nice, good shout out. Right, we have a couple of minutes left. Oh, is there another one either of you had that you wanted to cover?
I think the only other piece I had is, so we talked about the get metric data. It can be the same thing on the put metric data side of things too. So if we're grabbing like a lot of application data from like a custom app that I'm running, we can look at what the options are for pushing the data out to CloudWatch to reduce the amount of requests. So two things I think we've seen here. One of them is that put metric data request. We can, again, kind of put more metrics in each one of those API requests, up to 20 metrics and up to 150 values per metric. Or there's another option of using statistics set. So this is another API request that will let us put in, a couple of different values, and we may be able to reduce the amount of requests that we're making to push the data out to CloudWatch by using an alternate API request.
Awesome, cool. So we'll post this video on YouTube, and then John, if you could send me any of those links about that stuff, then I can put them in the description section underneath. And one last thing, because I know you touched on it when we were chatting earlier, John, that there was a really interesting Reinvent Talk that you mentioned to me. What was that about? And we can share the link to that.
There is, yeah, and it kind of pulls all these, kind of threads back together, right? So we've got this like cost visibility component using tools like the Curve, using Cost Explorer, and then there's, the telemetry side of it, which, we're going to be able to take advantage of CloudWatch to kind of put that extra layer of visibility on top. So the talk that I really liked, it was actually from last year, 2020, and it was about turbocharging your optimization with CloudWatch data. So if this is something that you want to kind of roll your sleeves up with and sink your teeth into, I definitely recommend checking out that talk. It's only about 30 minutes.
Nice, great. I think we've given a lot of links, a lot of information. So maybe within the last 2 minutes, what would be your one kind of main takeaway from today? Biddle, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I use CloudWatch to suss out a lot of like FUD. There's for all intents and purposes, like you might have an engineering team that thinks the workload needs a bunch of different components that you drew up in a whiteboard one day before you launched the workload. And then 6 months later, someone in finance is saying that costs too much. It's not doing what we thought it would. Like, that's CloudWatch. That's why we built this. Like, use this tool. That's what's going to make this so it's kind of like less of opinions between two teams and more of like data presenting and driving the conversation. Just to close this thought out, like one of my really great customers, they thought they're going to need to use storage enabled local, like R5D, M5D type of machine. And from CloudWatch, they realized we're really not using that like we thought we would. Let's ditch it and move to a new instance type and buy a savings plan. And they saved a bunch of money. So
nice. What about you, John?
Yeah, I think it's just going back to revisiting like what you need, right? And sometimes that could be reducing the resolution for metrics because it's a great way to save cost if we're kind of operating at scale, or sometimes it could be increasing the resolution. Maybe I get more insight from, pulling more data back over or kind of different data points. But I think it's looking at the data that you have right now, finding out, if there's an opportunity to maybe better align that to a challenge that you have, and know that you have a lot of flexibility with this to kind of get more granular, or to kind of look more at like the trend level, if that's a better fit. So probably my last takeaway.
Nice. And with my 30 seconds to spare, I'm just going to say, go and look at your costs on CloudWatch, see if you're spending money on it, and see why you're spending money, because it is a nice little thing to dig into. So next week we'll be doing a customer story session on kind of taking the full journey of cost optimization with one of the guys in our team, Andy, who we've mentioned before. He's finally coming on the show. We've been trying to convince him for ages, but gradually he's now coming on. We will see you all next week. Have a lovely time, and speak to you then.